Today's daf is daf Lamed Aleph, and we'll begin with Amar le Abaye on the second line from the top. Abaye asks the following question to Rav Yosef: Bia b'miktas shmei bia o lo. If a person enters completely his whole body into the Azara, then he certainly needs Tvila. But what if he only puts in part of his body? And that's called Bia b'miktas. And this is a sugya Masechet Tzvachim, a daf lamed beis amid beis. There's machlokas about Bia b'miktas with regard to a tameh who takes his hands and puts it inside the migdash. Ula says in the name Reish Lakish, Bia b'miktas shmei Bia, and he's chayav kares, as if his whole body had entered into the azar and he's tameh. Ravina Amar, he has a different transmission of Reish Lakish. Eno chayav kares b'Bia b'miktas. And he's only chayav malchus, not kares. Ravin says that Reish Lakish did not speak about a case of nogea b'kodesh, but Bia b'miktas eno Bia, midrabanan, he's not allowed to go in, even b'miktas. In any event, Al Gemara Abaye in front of Rav Yosef is vacillating about the story of the person who's b'chezkas tar. He has to enter part of his body into the migdash, and does he need tefillah or does he not need tefillah? And since his tefillah is an institution that was established by the Rabbanan, maybe the Rabbanan in this case, even if they would hold Bia b'miktas lavsh maybe, and maybe here they would be maker, or maybe we should pass in Bia b'miktas lavsh maybe. Amalei, Rav Yosef responds to Abaye, I'll prove it to you from the Mitzorah. Bahonos of Mitzorah yochichu shehem Bia b'miktas. Vitanya, we learned in a brisa. We had this brisa yesterday. Mitzorah tovel v'omed b'shar nikanor. On the 8th day of his tara, when the Mitzorah brings his karbonos of tara, he places his hands inside the azara, so that the Kohen will do a hazah from the dam ha'osham and from the lug ha'shemen. And the rest, the balance of his body is outside the azara, and yet the brisa insists that he has to be tovel, and he stands at the gateway into the azar that's called Sharon Nikanor. But we see clearly that a Mitzorah needs Tvila, even though yesterday he was Tovel on the 7th day, but now he's putting his hands inside the Azara in order to receive the bahonos, the matan bahonos, the hazon is bahonos on his hands. Is obviously we hold Bia b'miktas shmei Bia, and he's required to be Tovel himself. Who the Gemara presents the following suffix with regard to the Chi of Tvila before he enters into the Azara. Sakin arucha v'yishchot. Can he stand outside the Azara and he's holding on to a long knife, and the shechita has to be done of the carbon inside the azar, but he doesn't enter into the azar. He's only holding the knife, and he himself is situated outside of the azara. And can he now, through this orchestration, exempt himself from tvila because he didn't enter into the azar? Even his hands didn't enter the azar. He's holding on to the handle of the knife, this long knife, outside the Azara. And Tibayla ben Zoma, Tibayla Rabbanan, the Pligi Aleit Rabbi Yehuda. We can raise this suffix according to Ben Zoma. Ben Zoma holds that the Chi of Tvila, before we enter into the Azar, is Dorai, so we derive it from a Kavachomer from the Kohen Gadol. And we can ask the same question according to the Rabbanan, who, if you recall the second brisa that we quoted yesterday on Daf Lamed, disagreed with Rabbi Yehuda and did not require any sort of a tvila before you go into the mikvah. The only exception was the mitzora because he is murgal betuma. He's used to tuma. He exposed himself to tuma, and there's more of a chash that he might be coming. But other people don't need tvila. And now the Gemara analyzes the suffix. Tiboile leben zoma. According to Ben Zoma, we could vacillate about this question. Ad kan lo machayev Ben Zoma el ligaboy. When does Ben Zoma say that you chayev tvila only ligavoy? Meaning, if he enters into the Azara, but if he remains outside the Azara, lo, Ben Zoma would relieve him of the Chiyuv Tvila. O Dilma, or perhaps even though he's outside the Azara, we should still require Tvila. Why? Because Dilma, we should be afraid Asi Lim Shuche. Maybe as he's doing the Shechita, he might lean into the Azara, and therefore we shouldn't take any chances. And up front, we should require tefillah. Gemara continues, Tiboiler Rabbanan the Pligei Rabbi Yehuda, Ad Kan Lo Kavi Rabbanan Osam. When do the Rabbanan alleviate Stam B'nei Adam, with the exception of Mitzorah, from tefillah? Because they have a Cheskes Tara. They can go into the Azor without tefillah. That's only the Lo Kavi Avoda. That's for a person who's entering into the Azor, and the Rabbanan pater him from tvila because he's not going into the Azara to do avoda. But here he's shechting a karman, dika avid avoda. He's engaged in avoda. Lo, here the Chachamim would agree that we have to be mechayiv tvila, and we have to be more machmir. In the case of Mitzorah, he's not doing any avoda, and therefore there's no reason to require tefillah other than the fact that he is murgal betuma. But this person who's doing the avodah of shchitas hazevach, and the avodah itself is taking place inside the Azara, it must take place into the Azara, then we should certainly require tefillah, even according to the Rabbanan. Now, the truth is that the Tosfos Yeshanim interprets that the reason in the case of Avoda we should admit that even the Chacham will require tefillah, that's because he might be nimshach, he might go into the Azara. But that doesn't make any sense unless you're talking about the Chachamim or Ben Zoma, Rabbi Yehuda, that require tefillah when you go into the. But rather, let's go with the Pirush of Rabbeinu Eliakim, and his girsa here is that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Gemara is vacillating about whether or not the Kal V'chomer of Ben Azai would be accepted by Rabbi Yehuda, because he was always afraid when he's doing the avodah that he might be nimshach and he might violate this mitzvah aseh of doing the avodah without tefillah. And the Gemara blives would take Amesh tefillos v'asar kiddushin tovel. The Mishnah establishes that during the course of Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol engages in 5 tefillos every time he changes his begadim, which will happen 5 times during the course of the day. And he needs asara 10 times kiddush yadayim raglayim from the me'akiyar. Now, the only exception as far as the makom tefillah, meaning all the tefillos, with the exception of one of the 5, the first of the 5, have to be implemented in a makom kaddish. The tefillah rishona can be in a makom chulin. Tana Rabbanan, we learned in the Brayso, Chamesh tefillos v'asar kiddushim tovel kohen gadol makadish bo bayom v'kulam b'kodesh b'beis hapar v'chutz mirishona shoysa b'chol al gabi shar hamoyim u'b'tzad lishkaso hoysa. There were 2 places where you'll find a mikvah. One was in the Azara, and that's called b'beis haparva. And there was a lishka, a special chamber, that was called a Beis HaParva, and on the gag, on the roof of the Beis HaParva, there was a mikvah, and all the tefillos of the Kohen Gadol took place in that mikvah, which was in the Azor, in the Kodesh, on top of the Beis HaParva, except the first tefillah. That first tefillah was bechol, because as far as that tefillah is concerned, the Kohen Gadol is wearing bigdei chol, and therefore he doesn't need a tefillah b'kodesh. He'll need a tefillah before he goes into the Azara, like any Kohen needs a tefillah before he enters into the Azara, according to most of the Tanoim, Ben Zomer, Rabbi Yehuda, and even according to Chachamim, perhaps, who don't normally require a tefillah before you go into the Azara, but if you're going in for the Avodah, you require a tefillah. So certainly the Kohen Gadol, even before his first tefillah, even before he starts the Avodah, he needs a tefillah, but that could be b'chol. Like any Kohen, before he starts the Avodah, he does the tefillah outside the Azara, and then he goes into the Azara. And this tefillah took place at the Shar HaMayim. The Shar HaMayim was located outside of the Azara. It was actually proximate to the Lishka of the Kohen Gadol. This tefillah has nothing to do with Yom Kippur. This is because any day of the year, there's a chiv tefillah before you start the avodah and enter into the azara. And therefore, like any other tefillah before you enter the azara, it's b'chol, and that's on Shar HaMayim. However, the balance of the tefillos, they are generated by Yoma Kippurim, and there the Torah says in Vayikra Tezayin, Parshas Achrimos, it says, B'makom kadosh. Amar Abaye, Shmamino, I want to prove from this brisa that establishes that the tefillah Kohen Gadol on the first occasion, on the first round, was on top of Shar HaMayim. I want to prove from this that the Ein Etam, which we'll see is a certain kind of a mayon, a very unique spring, and that is actually the spring that supplied water to the mikvah for the tefillah of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. And someone identified with a pasuk in Yoshua, Perek Tezvav, it talks about Mei Naftoach. In any event, there's an entire sugya about this in Masechet Zvachim, about this particular spring called the Ein Etam. When David HaMelech and Shmuel HaNavi derived from the pasuk that the Beis HaMikdash has to be built on the highest spot in Eretz Yisrael. That's the sugya in Zvachim Daf Nun Daled Omin Beis. However, the highest spot in Eretz Yisrael is actually Ein Etam. But rather than build the Beis HaMikdash at Ein Etam, they decided to build it a little bit lower than Ein Etam. And the Gemara in Zvachim goes through a whole analysis as to why they were allowed to do so when it was clear from the pasuk that they should place the Beis HaMikdash on the highest point. Now, it's true that Ein Etam was located higher than the Beis HaMikdash, but how high was it? And Abai is going to now derive a calculation that it was actually Gavoa Mikarka Azara Esrim V'Shalosh Amos, 23 Amos. Now, this calculation is based on the fact that the Shar HaMayim, like any other Shar in the Mikdash, was 20 Amos high. And now we're going to prove that the mikveh itself was 3 Amos high. And therefore, the water of the Ein Etam could not flow uphill to something that's higher than its source. And therefore, if the Ein Etam mikveh, which is the mikveh of the Shar HaMayim, was located at the highest point, then that must be a little bit, Ein Etam must be a little bit higher so that the water could come down to that highest point. And if the mikveh was 23 amos high from the ground of the Beis HaMikdash, then the Ein Etam was 23 amos plus a mashu higher than that. And we have a Mishnah in Masechet Midos in the second parak. It says called Psachim Shahayu Sham, regarding all the gates that surrounded the Beis HaMikdash. Gvoa Masar Amo, the Rachvan Eser Amos. What's important for us is the height was 20 amos, And we had a whole discussion about that as far as the Kohen who shechts the paraduma, and he has to see all the way to the Pesach HaHeichal, which is too high. And in that context, also the Gemara at the beginning of Sukkah describes the Pesach HaHeichal. Anyway, let's assume that all the sha'arim that surround the Mikdash were 20 amos high, chutz mishal ulam. The only exception was that when you entered into the Beis HaMikdash building, the structure, and the ulam, which took you from the Azara into the Heichal, and the ulam was a huge room, and the dalsos ha'ulam were 40 amos high. That's the Gemara at the beginning of Sukkah that I was referring to. But in any event, the Shar HaMayim, which is again the mikvah that's on top of this gate called the water gate, nothing to do with Nixon, is a gate that's 20 amos high, and now we're going to prove that the mikveh itself was 3 amos high. The Sanya we learned in the Brisa, Pasuk tells us with regard to in Vayikra Tesvav, with regard to Tvila b'mikvah, it says v'rachatz bisaro. The pasuk says v'rachatz b'mayim es kol bisaro. B'mayim b'mei mikvah kol bisaro. Mayim shekol gufo ole bahen. So let's see if we can appreciate this drasha that's codified here in the Brisa. And this is the parsha, as I said before, Vayikra Tesvav, L'gabi Balkeri, Atobel Taroso, V'rochatz, B'mayim. It says B'mayim, not B'mayim, but B'mayim. And B'mayim means Mei Mikvah. Now, Mei Mikvah is water that's gathered naturally from different places where the water falls from the heavens and flows into a certain place, which is called a mikveh, the gathering of water, as opposed to mayim she'uvim, water that's collected in a receptacle, which is excluded and disqualified from mikveh. Now it says, kol bisara. It means that he has to immerse into a mikveh that has enough water, mayim shekol gufa ola bahem, that his entire body, in one fell swoop, bevasachas, entering into the water, can be covered by this water. And now we're going to try to calculate exactly how much of a volume of water you would need to cover the average man's body. Kol gufo ola bahem. Amahein, ama al ama berum shalosh amos. He says that shalosh amos is gova seifav shel adam. So from the floor up to the top of the shoulders of an average person is 3 amos. And this is derived, as Tosas quotes it here, the Ramaskal Amma, from a halacha in Baba Basra called hezek, that you need to build between your chatzah and your friend, your neighbor's chatzah, a kotzel, of 4 amos, so there shouldn't be hezek re'iyah if he invades your privacy by singing. So we see that your head can reach a height of more than 3 amos, and his neck and his head is the equivalent of 1 amma. Fine. So now we're going to assume that his body is shalosh amos. Umasha dai b'shir shalosh amos ben mikvah b'shum shekar nitzas amayim tzofim amayim v'olim u'mechasim es rosha. So the premise here is that he immerses himself in water up to the top of his shoulders, and then the water will jump up, because that's what happens when you go into a mikvah, and it will cover his head. The Shiur Chachamim, and how much of a volume of water would it take to cover a height of 3 amos with a width of 1 amma? That's called arboim sa. So hence we derive the conclusion that the minimum volume of water for any mikvah, for tefillah and tara, has to be 40 sa. Now, if the gova, the height of any shar, including the shar hamayim in the mikdash, is 20 amma, and now you're building a kli on top of the shar to receive the water, that kli has to have a height of 3 amos. Since the eno eta mayim that is coming down into the mikvah has to be higher than that, it means it's got to be a minimum of 23 amos. That's going to be the minimum height of the mikvah.